I would not for a moment wish to suggest by telling the parable of Lysenko that the fate of Soviet science, under that fool's sway, is remotely comparable to the state of contemporary Western research in even the most politically overpowering university setting. But the extreme instance should suffice to demonstrate that ideology of any kind and science are at best inappropriate bedfellows. Science may indeed uncover unpleasant truths, but the critical thing is that they are truths. Any effort, whether wicked or well-meaning, to conceal truth or impede its disclosure is destructive. Too often in our free society, scientists willing to take on questions with political ramifications have been made to pay an unjust price. When in 1975 E. O. Wilson of Harvard published Sociobiology, a monumental analysis of the evolutionary factors underlying the behavior of animals, ranging from ants, his own particular subject of expertise, to humans, he faced a firestorm of rebuke in the professional literature as well as the popular media. An anti-Wilson book published in 1984 bore a title that said it all: "Not in our genes." Wilson was even attacked physically when protesters, objecting to the genetic determinism they perceived in his work, dumped a jug of water on him during a public meeting. Similarly, Robert Plomin, whose work on the genetics of human intelligence we shall presently address, found the American Academy so hostile that he decamped from Penn State to England. Passions inevitably run high when science threatens to unsettle or redefine our assumptions about human society and our sense of ourselves, our identity as a species, and our identities as individuals. What could be a more radical question than this? Does the way I am owe more to a sequence of A's, T's, G's, and C's inherited from my parents, or to the experiences I've had ever since my father's sperm and mother's egg fused together many long years ago? It was Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, who was the first to frame the question as one of nature versus nurture. And the implications spill over into less philosophical, more practical areas. Are all math students born equal, for instance? If the answer is no, it may well be a waste of time and money trying to force differential equations down the throats of people like me, who are simply not wired to take the stuff on board. In a society built on an egalitarian ideal, the notion that all men are not born equal is an anathema to many people. And not only is there a lot at stake, but the issues are very difficult to resolve. An individual is a product of both genes and environment. How can we disentangle the two factors to determine the extent of each one's contribution? If we are dealing with laboratory rats, we could conduct a set of simple experiments involving breeding and rearing under specified uniform conditions. But happily, humans are not rats, so illuminating data are hard to come by. This combination of the debate's importance and the near impossibility of satisfactorily resolving it makes for a perennially lively argument. But a free society should not shrink from honest questions honestly asked. And what is critical is that the truths we discover are then applied only in ethical ways. With a lack of reliable data, the nature-nurture debate was entirely subject to the shifting winds of social change. Early in the 20th century, during the heyday of the eugenics movement, nature was king. But when the fallacies of eugenics became apparent, culminating in its horrific applications by the Nazis and others, nurture began to gain the upper hand. In 1924, John Watson, no relation, the American father of an influential school of psychology called behaviorism, summarized his nurturist perspective as follows: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. The notion of the child as tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which experience and education can write any future, dovetailed nicely with the liberal agenda that grew out of the 60s. Genes and the determinism they stood for were out. Discounting inheritance, psychiatrists preached that mental illness was caused by varieties of environmental stress, an assertion that inspired endless guilt and paranoia among the parents of the afflicted. Where did we go wrong? They asked. The tabula rasa remains the paradigm of choice among the politically entrenched defenders of some increasingly untenable views of human development. Among some unregenerate hardliners of the women's movement, for example, the notion of biological, genetic, differences in cognitive aptitudes between the sexes is simply unspeakable. Men and women are equally capable of learning any task, period. The fact that men are more common in some fields and women in others is, these theorists would have it, purely a result of divergent social pressures. The male slate is inscribed with one destiny, the female with another. And it begins with our laying that pink blanket on the baby girl and the blue one on the baby boy. Today we are seeing a swing away from the extreme nurturist position embodied by the other Watson. And it is no coincidence that this drift away from behaviorism is coinciding with our first glimpses of the genetics underpinning behavior. As we saw in Chapter 11, for years the genetics of humans has lagged behind that of fruit flies and other creatures, owing to a lack of genetic markers and the impossibility of doing breeding experiments on people. But since the introduction in 1980 of DNA-based genetic markers, the analysis of human traits through mapping of related genes has advanced by leaps and bounds. Most of the effort has, understandably, been expended on meeting the most urgent human need genetics can address: diagnosis and treatment of inherited disease. Nevertheless, some efforts have been directed toward non-medical questions. Robert Plomin, for example, has used this approach to hunt up genes influencing IQ, taking advantage of an annual gathering in Iowa of super bright school children from across the nation. With an average IQ of 160, these slightly scary kids were an obvious place to start to look for genes that might affect IQ. Plomin compared their DNA to that of a sample of normal kids with average range IQs like yours and mine, and indeed he found a weak association between a genetic marker on chromosome 6 and stratospheric IQ. Here was reason to suppose that a gene or several genes in that region might in some way contribute to IQ. Of course, any mechanism governing such a complex trait is apt to involve many genes. My IQ is a respectable, but definitely not stellar, 122. I discovered it by sneaking a quick look at a list on a teacher's desk when I was 11.